I'm back today uh, on my evening walk, and I think the last live stream I did during my evening walk went really well. So I thought I'd do it again. This also gives me a motivation to go for a walk. Uh, Now the lighting is not too good because I don't have one of those fancy setups with a ring light and everything. But that's okay. It's not like my face is, like Robert Redford or Shah Rukh Khan, so you're not missing anything. So last time I talked about uh, the election in West Bengal and the condition of Indian democracy. So since then, there have been a couple of very interesting developments. One is that Manoj Agarwal. Now, this is the person who was the chief election officer of West Bengal. So he was basically the person in charge of running the entire election system in West Bengal. Well, guess what? He has been made, so I think something like special advisor to the CM, new CM of West Bengal. Right? So, no conflict of interest there. I mean, it is just so brazen. They're not even trying to hide the fact that they fixed the match. They're like, screw you, we fixed the match. What can you do about it? Right? Then the person who was in charge of the so-called special intensive revision in West Bengal, the process, so-called process by which they deleted 27 lakh votes from the voter rolls. So apparently his name is Subrata Gupta, and he has been made the new chief secretary of the incoming West Bengal administration. So there really is no pretense anymore. I mean, it's clear. Why would you do that? Why would you make the person who was in charge of SIR in West Bengal the chief secretary? Right? The reason you would do that is because the chief secretary is a person who has to give uh, approval for all prosecutions and investigations of offences, especially those by government officials. And so putting him in charge as a chief secretary ensures that first of all he will never obviously investigate his own misdeeds. But anyways, the point is that all of this is, everybody can see it. सबको पता है, सबको दिख रहा है. So things will work themselves out because people will see what is happening. And India is a very big country. It's a very diverse country. And how big it is something sometimes people don't understand or don't fathom. Right? So it's not possible to control India. They can't really be any kind of dictatorship. I mean, you can install in every single state, you could install a BJP government, and it still wouldn't be possible to control India as one coherent political unit. It's simply not possible. So India will always be multicolored. It will always be diverse in that regard, and nothing is going to change that. Now, that's for politics. I'm also a physicist, and I like to talk about physics. And in physics also there is politics, unfortunately. One of the sad aspects about the politics in physics is that there are some prevailing conceptions, or I should say misconceptions, which have existed now for nearly 50 or 60 years in my community, which is high energy physics, high energy theory. And I'm a theoretical physicist, so I work on quantum gravity, black holes, elementary particles, and things. And in this field, string theory was the dominant paradigm for, like I said, 60 years. It started in 1970, and once it took off in the 1980s, it became quickly a self-evident fact in the eyes of many that this indeed was the theory of everything, and we just had to fill in the gaps. Now, of course, it turned out to be not so simple as experience has shown us, and now we are at a stage where it is not uncommon to find some of the most popular physics influencers on YouTube and social media, such as Sabine Hossenfelder, who, by the way, I think is a truly brilliant physicist. And but again, she is a great example of what happens if you don't try to toe the string theory line. You have to end up as an influencer to make a living. So one aspect of this is that there is a preprint server called arXiv, and that's spelled arXiv, and that's where everybody, all the researchers, young and old, they post their latest work, right? So arXiv basically revolutionized modern science, because it said that you, in order to communicate your research work with the rest of the world, you don't need to pay hundreds of dollars to get published in some journal. You can just post it online. It gets an arXiv ID and everything. Now, of course, if you have an open system like this, it's bound to be misused, and that's understandable. And it's also understandable that the people running it would want to minimize any such misuse, because the world is full of many people who consider themselves to be great physicists, but unfortunately have never really put in the effort it might take to do anything relevant. So those people are referred to I think somewhat in a cruel way as crackpots. I don't like that term myself, because I myself have been called a crackpot on many occasions. So, but arXiv, I have found over the past 10 years now, that arXiv will put papers on hold or reject them entirely if they are from a certain group of people, or they follow a certain, they try to investigate a certain paradigm, or they try to challenge the conception that string theory is correct in every single aspect of its formulation. And even if you say, like I do, that string theory is correct, but it's correct as an effective theory. It's not correct as a fundamental theory. It's an emergent theory which arises from an underlying quantum geometric description, and but they don't like that because they have invested their entire lives, their careers, everything uh, in saying that string theory is, it's everything, it's the alpha and the omega. There was nothing before that, nothing after, nothing will come after that. Apart from the fact of how toxic such a perspective is for any science, it's also incorrect. And so my most recent paper, which I have submitted to arXiv some days ago, has been put on hold. Again, this is a experience I'm not unfamiliar with. So they have done this in the past with nearly every paper of mine, and I don't have a faculty position now because I left mine in 2023. But I know many people who not only have faculty positions, but they have very prestigious faculty positions, and they have done such truly incredible, groundbreaking work. You know, things which have shifted technological paradigms. You know, one of them is, I'm probably going to get his name wrong. I think it's Yuan Lao or Ling. He is a Chinese physicist, and he has done, you know, some of the world. He's one of the world's foremost quantum information scientists, and even his papers have been rejected from arXiv. Now, you know, arXiv might say that that is actually evidence of how neutral they are, how impartial they are. But I think it's not. I think it's quite the opposite. Unfortunately, the string theorists who started arXiv and who have made a monumental contribution to science and human society. Okay, so these people deserve like Nobel Peace Prize or something. But it's also time for them to retire. And the arXiv administration and the editorial boards need to be changed to reflect the fact that it is clear that string theory is no longer the end all and be all of theoretical physics. It never was. It never was. So, anyways, after all that complaining, let me come to the physics. So my most recent paper is on something called the arrow of time. And this might sound very strange because when you think of time, you don't normally think of arrows. But I mean, there is an arrow of time, right? Because what is an arrow? An arrow is basically a line segment which points in one direction, right? And there's a tail end of the arrow and there's a head of the arrow, right? So you can see that the arrow flows from back to front, and similarly, from everything that we know and we experience, anything we observe, time in the universe around us flows, so to speak, from past to future, right? Like there's a clear sense of what is past and a clear sense of what the future is going to be, right? You don't see people walking backwards. You don't see, you see cell division. You don't see eukaryotic cells coming together and joining. So, and all of this in most common understanding of time's arrow, outside of high energy and outside of theoretical physics, is often expressed in terms of the concept of entropy. And so entropy is a measure of, as they say, roughly speaking, disorder. Though I disagree with that statement. I mean, it's a measure of the information content of any system, basically. And so the statement of second law of thermodynamics is that the entropy of any closed system increases over time, right? So you can reverse that statement and define an arrow of time, right, as the set of processes which lead to an increase in entropy. So something like that would be called a thermodynamic arrow of time. Now, what I'm working at, the level I'm working at, is at the level of quantum gravity, quantum geometry, and there we really have to struggle with this concept of what time is, because we can't use the Newtonian concept of time as something that is flowing and smooth and the same everywhere. I mean, we haven't been able to use it for more than 150 years now. Somebody's having a party. But even in the Einsteinian conception of time, time is again something that flows from past to future. And when you study general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravitation, you always treat time as having a fixed direction. Now, many people, before me have explored this question. Right? It's not a new question. I'm not addressing a problem which has not been known previously. So, what is new? What is more relevant in my contribution? What I'm saying new is that there is a cosmological arrow of time, and it's an emergent arrow of time. What do we mean by emergent? Emergent meaning that if you look at space-time on the smallest scales, where geometry becomes discrete and fuzzy, and concepts like points and lines and planes don't have the same meaning. In fact, they don't have a meaning, right? And so at such scales, which we are normally referred to as the Planck scale, time is what I have shown in this paper is that time emerges from something known as a confinement-deconfinement phase transition. Now that's some very technical sounding jargon. So unless you're an expert, I won't expect you to know what a confinement phase transition is. But I'll try to give a more intuitive explanation. It's like, imagine that you have a net, right? You have a grid, and what's a grid? It's a set of nodes, it's a collection of points which are connected by lines. And I know that I just said that and lines don't have the same concept at the Planck scale. So instead of thinking of them as points and lines, think of them as, we'll call them something else. We'll call them nodes and edges. So it's a graph basically. And I think most people who have some amount of exposure to modern science understand what a graph is. So imagine that you have a graph. Now, there is a theory, there's a framework called loop quantum gravity, or LQG for short. But sadly, LQG is a acronym which is very common in other fields. So maybe that's one reason why LQG as a theory has not really caught on. LQG also stands for Liouville quantum gravity, which doesn't really have anything to do with loop quantum gravity. And LQG also stands for something like local quadrature Gaussian or some other method like that, which is a method that's used in computational physics. Anyways, so in loop quantum gravity, which is a very, very well established framework and which has been established by Abayashikar and others, is that geometry consists of these graphs at the Planck scale. And each node of a graph, you can think of it as a grain of sand, where each grain represents a volume of space. It's a region of space, a finite region of space. And so in this picture, space becomes like a crystal or like a lattice, right? It becomes discrete, it becomes quantized at the Planck scale. And when it's and the edges basically represent the connections between the various grains, and they are what give the whole graph a notion of connectivity and topology, which is another jargon, word of jargon. So now imagine that you have a graph like this, and it gives us a chunk of space, gives us a chunk of geometry, right? Because you can count all the nodes in it, add up the total volume, and so you'll get a chunk of space whose total volume is approximately goes as the number of nodes of the graph. Of course, the shape of the corresponding geometric region is determined by the shape of the graph also, but I won't go into that here. So now we have this chunk of volume, right? We have this piece of space, but what is time in this case, right? Can we say that there is a universal background time which is flowing everywhere the same? And we can't do that because, we've just quantized geometry. So instead of a global time, imagine that on each edge of this graph there is a clock which is living, and this clock can run either forwards or backwards. And the thing is that the clocks on different edges, they don't have to run in the same direction. You could have an edge where the clock runs back forwards and another edge where the clock runs backwards. And in a arbitrary graph, you would have like sprinkling of such clocks all over the graph with random directions for running forwards and running backwards, right? So those of you who have some kind of physics training will recognize that what this resembles is a system in condensed matter known as the Ising model, or if you want to be completely correct about the pronunciation, the easing model, but I'll go with easing because nobody will understand what I'm saying if I say easing. So in the Ising model, which is a model of magnetism basically, you have all these magnets which correspond to the elementary cells in a ferromagnet, right? The smallest magnetic dipoles one can have. And these dipoles can all point either forwards or backwards. And in a paramagnet, which is a substance which doesn't have a magnetic field, and again, I hope if I make any mistakes with my terminologies, you'll forgive me. All the magnetic dipoles are pointing in random directions. So the overall magnetic field of the substance averages out to zero because there is no, right, or there is no what we say coherence among all the spins. Now what happens is that, if there is a temperature, there's a background temperature, it can cause these magnetic dipoles to flip sign, right? So you imagine that, there's a trampoline and there's somebody jumping up and down on the trampoline, and if the temperature is high, they jump faster, and if the temperature is low, they jump slower. And basically a jump corresponds to a change in the direction of the dipole. So dipoles will keep switching direction randomly from up to down and down to up. Now, what will happen is that as you lower the temperature of the system, it will pass a point which is called a critical point, where the thermal fluctuations are not strong enough. And strong with respect to what? Right? I mean, strength and weakness is relative, right? It has to be with respect to something. So it's with respect to now these magnetic dipoles, they also have a force between them, right? So if you played with magnets, you know that if you put them next to each other, there is a force which pushes or pulls them together, right? So magnets, they want to either point in the same direction, which is known as ferromagnetism, or they prefer to point in the opposite direction, which is known as antiferromagnetism. And I'll just work with the example of ferromagnetism because that's simpler to understand for the time being. So what happens is that as the temperature is lowered, the strength of the attractive force between neighboring magnetic dipoles becomes larger than the typical thermal energy. And so what happens is that two neighboring dipoles will prefer to line up with each other than to go their own way. I mean, you can think of it as if you put two people in a room and chill the room, they will prefer to stick together than be apart. That's a very rough and a bad analogy, but it's an analogy that kind of works, I guess. So it's the same thing that is happening in this graph structure. There is a thermal background, and where this thermal background comes from, that I don't know, right? But there is a thermal background. You could say there's a fundamental thermal noise which exists, and in a way introducing this fundamental thermal noise is a bit like saying that there is a uniform global arrow of time which flows everywhere and is the same every place. So, but I mean, that's what physics is. To solve one problem, we just create another one. So we say that uh, there is this universal thermal background, which you can also do as a universal action reservoir, which might have some meaning for you if you have thought about these things. But if not, don't worry about it. And basically, the concept is the same as in a ferromagnet, is that the clocks sitting on different edges, they can tend to flip. They can tend to flip so that it's flowing, time is flowing in one direction, in one edge, and sometimes it's flowing in the opposite direction. And so at this level, there is no distinction between past and future. Both directions of both senses of flow are depending on where you are located in the graph. So now what happens is, as the temperature lowers, the clocks on different edges, they tend to synchronize, so to speak. And a clock on a neighboring edge, if it's running one way, we'll look at the clocks on the other edges and say, hey, look, these guys are running in that direction. What do I gain by trying to run in the opposite direction? Right? Let me just line up and be like them. And when it decides that, it's accepted into polite society, and coherence emerges. And when this coherence emerges on the larger scales, you have an emergent arrow of time on this graph. Now the details of my paper are all about the mechanism by which this happens, and I use various tools from high energy physics and condensed matter, such as tensor networks, and I use them in the context of loop quantum gravity. And I was probably one of the first, if not the first person, to advocate that spin networks and tensor networks are one and the same thing. But it can be risky to be too far ahead of time, right? Because then people really think you're nuts. And then, over time, over the next 6, 7, 8 years, as the realization starts filtering through, no, that's basically correct, then they all start writing papers on this topic. But anyways, this paper I've been working on, I wrote it in 2016 and 2018, between those 2 years. And the bulk of the work was completed in that time. And then I saw recently that people in the loop quantum gravity community have started talking about tensor networks. I mean, they've been talking about tensor networks for a long time. One of the pioneers in this area is a physicist from China called Moshin Han, right? So his paper came out 10 years ago, and so he's the leader by far. And there are others like him. One is Janet Lin-Yan Huang, and well, I can't think of other names, but there are people there. So, but their work was also ignored for the most part and treated as, sort of speculative and all. And it's only recently that it started to become the acceptable fashion, so to speak, that no, tensor networks is the correct language to talk about. So anyways, so once I saw that, okay, there's all this activity, I don't want to waste any more time. And I sat down with AI to figure out what needed to be done to finish my paper. And the bulk of the paper had been written with all the ideas, all the mechanisms, all the pieces, like I said, by 2018. But there were gaps that I hadn't been able to fill in. And AI, particularly Claude Sonnet, helped me fill in those gaps. And with the paper, I have attached AI use disclosure, which documents in detail the AI did exactly what I did. My paper is publicly available on GitHub. There's a repository called Times Arrow under my user ID, which is Space Cadet, and I think that's Space underscore Cadet. And anybody who wants to can go to that repository, download it, clone it, put it into an AI and ask, hey, does Deepak's AI disclosure statement match the history of commits to this repository? And you can check it. Because as far as I know, one can't fake a Git commit history on GitHub. I mean, you probably can. You have to be like in the CIA or NSA or something for that purpose. And, you know, I'm not. I'm just an unemployed theoretical physicist. And so I submitted this paper to arXiv. And the moment I submitted it, I saw the status change from submitted to on hold. And I was not surprised because in my experience, I know that arXiv has, again, I refer to arXiv, the preprint server. I know that arXiv has some kinds of lists, and pretty much the way that Twitter, now known unfortunately as X, labels different accounts and based on their ideology, and either limits or boosts their reach depending on whether the ideology matches that of the corporation running Twitter. It's in a similar way, arXiv also probably has labels for researchers, and most likely I have a non-zero value on their crackpot index. But that's fine, I don't mind, you know. I mean, I published in journals like Annals of Physics, EPJC, I mean, and, you know, I've given talks at Loops conferences, I've given talks at string conferences, and I'm not really too worried about my own sense of who I am and what I'm capable of. So I don't really care too much what label anybody else assigns to me. But of course, it is relevant for the sake of being able to spread your research and share it with others, that you know, this kind of system, and like I said, there needs to be a system which you know, filters out actual research from non-scientific ramblings. Otherwise, arXiv would just become a junk store. So, but I think the system they have in place is actually doesn't do that very well, because I see lots of junk papers making their way through, and I see a lot of highly respected, globally recognized physicists. I see their work being rejected, being put on hold, or being categorized by the system as belonging to something called the general physics category. And basically that's the category that they put you, where when they think that, okay, he's a crackpot, but what the hell, let's just let him have his archive, post him, right? So general physics is for the most part accepted, has this, you know, is understood, it's what the role it plays is. So anyways, I'll wait a few days, see if it's still on hold, and if not, I'll go raise hell on Twitter. That has worked in the past. They really don't like people pointing out the bias and hypocrisy in their system. So, but anyways, wish me luck. And yeah, in the description of this video, I'll share a link to my website where you can download the draft of the paper, and you can there's a web page which gives a description, an accessible description for non-experts of what my paper is all about and what I've done and the methods I've used, etc. So with that, I've talked about West Bengal, and I've talked about arXiv, and I've talked about the Arrow of Time, and this has been a long live stream, 40 minutes, and I know nobody has patience to watch 40 minutes, but what the heck, right? Anyways, I'll sign off and see you guys on my next walk or walk and talk, hopefully. Bye bye.